Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, the real Slim Shady of the contemporary American intellectual scene. I have two preambulatory thoughts on today's conversation with Greg Berman, who was co-founder and was for many years the CEO of the Center for Justice Innovation, a New York-based group that's done a lot of really amazing work in the criminal justice reform space. So two thoughts. One is that it's just a really great conversation. It's our paid conversation of the month. So for those of you who aren't paid subscribers, you should think about paying at least for this month so that you can get all of it. We continue to say smart and surprising things all the way through. So it's not one of those podcast conversations, which is a lot of them, alas, where the hosts and guests are just going over and over the same territory for the whole time. So pay if you're of a mind to do so. And if you want to listen but have sufficient budgetary anxieties that paying would feel like too much of an indulgence, shoot me an email at djops@gmail.com, djopps@gmail.com. I will be happy to comp you a paid subscription. The other thing that I wanted to say is that this conversation feels to me like it's both like and unlike a lot of my previous conversations that I've had in what you might call the anti-woke left liberal space. So it's like it because we are in that space. Greg and I are both liberals who have developed some critiques over the last decades of some of the tendencies of those to the left of us that we think are destructive and self-sabotaging of the goals, the political goals that we have, and maybe, if I give them the benefit of the doubt, that the people on the left who are doing the things that I don't like have also. The conversation is us fleshing out some of those critiques, specifically in the criminal justice space, and also in the kind of more general nonprofit space. Greg just wrote a book, the title of which is The Nonprofit Crisis, kind of about struggles in that space, a lot of which are arising from some of these tensions. So the way in which it is unlike a lot of my past conversations is that the space that Greg happens to work in, the criminal justice space, is one where there's just been, in a lot of ways, it's a really happy story. That's a strange thing to say, post George Floyd. But if you look at it, and the people who know about this certainly know this, there have just been amounts of progress over the last few decades, both in terms of kind of diminishing crime rates, but also, and not unrelated, diminishing incarceration rates as well. And they seem to be continuing. There was a kind of interruption in positive trends in the few years during and after COVID and George Floyd, but there's been a resumption of just the positive trends. So crime rates and incarceration rates are going down, seem to be going down. I mean, at some point they will probably plateau, but as Greg points out, at least in the incarceration space, they may keep going down further as we kind of reap the benefits of just less crime over the past few decades. So fewer people to arrest, less incarceration. So this is an area where good things have happened. And they've happened in no small part because, I think, of a synthesis of the kind of incrementalist, nuanced, careful, slow boring of hard boards type of work that people like Greg do, with, I think, the kind of moral passion that more often than not tends to emanate from those parts of the left that I often have a hard time with. And it is always useful for me to be reminded of that fact, of the moral passion part of it, when I can get too dark on the sins of the left. I enjoy being a kind of Waldorf and Statler type, but the Waldorfs and Statlers don't get people out into the streets and don't go into the streets themselves. So it's good for me to be reminded of that and of the role that certainly has been played in the success stories of the criminal justice movement over the past few decades by people on the left who I would have all sorts of disagreements with, but who've really done the work while I've kind of sat on the side and observed. But you probably knew there was a but coming. It is also useful to remind the left that they are simply wrong when they think that liberals don't make a difference in people's lives. I don't think you can plausibly look at the work that the reform movement in which Greg has been a player has done over the past few decades and not credit it with making a huge difference in people's lives for the better. And I just think it's clear that it couldn't have happened any other way, given the complexity, not just of the politics of criminal justice reform in terms of having to kind of negotiate a lot of these things in states that are maybe not deep blue, maybe not blue at all. Red states, there's also been a lot of really good work in red states, but the policies themselves as well. It's simply not an issue that lends itself to simple or short-term solutions. It has to be the slow boring of hard boards, in Max Weber's famous term, and it has to be sustained over the long term by genuine moral passion. But I think that moral passion has to be channeled into strategic, structural behavior that is led by, strategic campaigning, organizing, politicking, that is led by people who care too much about the issue to let themselves take refuge in the kinds of moralism and purity testing that are just constant temptations in these spaces. And I think, it should go without saying, this is not just the case in the criminal justice space. That I think probably a lot of the issues that are facing us, the biggest challenges that we face in creating a more just and equal society are of this sort. So we liberals have a role to play too, maybe the key role, but at least key partnership role. Final note, my audio is a bit tinny in here for the first 2 minutes of the conversation because I didn't notice I was sitting a few feet away from the mic, and then I noticed, so it gets better after that. So worry not that you will be subjected to tinny Dan for the duration of this relatively long conversation. I hope you enjoy. In fact, I'm pretty damn sure you'll enjoy. So on to it. Peace. Greg Berman, welcome to the show. I hereby anoint you an eminent American by the power vested in me by the spirit of temperance, nuance, and moderation, which runs so deep in your work.
I'll take it. That sounds good.
We connected because I had posted something to Substack just to notes, and I don't even remember what it was in response to, but it was about criminal justice stuff. And I think it was coming from a place of frustration on my part, kind of in general about how the sort of criminal justice conversation is conducted. I mean, more on the left than the right, but partially that's because sometimes I feel like on the right, at least in the sort of mass media right, it's conducted with absolutely zero nuance whatsoever. So at least on the left, though I have my frustrations, there's space for conversation about it. And I think you just said something nice about my comment or something. So then I ended up kind of looking into your stuff, which covers a wide range of things. But I was thinking, let's just start by talking about it's now called the Center for Justice Innovation. Is that right?
Correct.
It was for many years the Center for Courts Innovation. I think you founded it, right? And then ran it for 10 or 15 years.
I was part of a small team that founded it, and then I was the executive director for 18 years. I left in 2020 with impeccable timing. My last day was March 13th, 2020. Did not even go into the office on my last day of work, which was a little bit of a bummer in some respects, but good in other respects.
I mean, impeccable timing in two senses. One, COVID, obviously, which I assume is what you were just referring to. But I think the other piece of impeccable timing is you avoided some, although I'm sure not all, of just the sort of post George Floyd insanity. I'll put that word on it. You don't have to. Insanity that's kind of afflicted, broadly speaking, left liberal nonprofits and advocacy groups in the last few years. And that's something you write about in your most recent book on nonprofits, but probably impeccable timing in both of that sense. There are probably some very hard decisions and conflicts you avoided by conveniently stepping down at that point. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And I do think that I avoided the worst of it. And one of the things that I did immediately post stepping down from running this job was I had a column. There's a magazine here called City and State in New York, which is geared towards government and nonprofits. And for 3 years, I did a monthly column where I was talking to nonprofit directors every month about their experience and trying to distill lessons. And it was just really notable how miserable they all were starting in 2020. And some of that seeped into the interviews, but some of it, people were not willing to say out loud in a public setting. But the second that the microphone went off, just utter and complete exasperation at how, running a nonprofit is a tough job in the best of times, right? You've got to raise money, you've got to manage staff, you've got to have a vision, yada, yada, yada. But it just seemed like the degree of difficulty went up inexorably in the months following the George Floyd killing. And there was no kind of safe harbor, right? Came for big organizations, came for small organizations, came for leaders who were new, came for leaders who were old, came for leaders who were people of color, came for the white people. And so, yes, I managed to avoid the worst of it. But just to be clear, like I don't know what your sense of the world is, but I got a sense that things were shifting well before 2020. And so I did live and lead through part of the insanity as you deem it. And, I just found the space I occupied. So I was running a fairly large nonprofit that was dedicated to criminal justice reform that was, liberal, left of center organization, totally predicated on a critique of the criminal justice system, right? Totally dedicated towards promoting alternatives to incarceration and changing the behavior of system actors, prosecutors, cops, judges, et cetera. And just the tectonic plates were shifting in this weird way that I'm still trying to make sense of. And it's part of the reason why I've been attracted to your work and others and some of your guests' work, because I'm still trying to make heads or tail of it. But something shifted. And, I think that I'm a liberal, reformist, normie. My politics are pretty normal, Democrat, voted Democrat all my life. And it just became really hard to be myself or speak honestly, even within this organization that I had helped to found and lead and had enormous sweat equity in.
Yeah. Oh, God, there's so much I want to talk about there. Criminal justice reform, obviously, I said that's the eye of the storm in a sense, right? And I think one of the things that has been so frustrating to me, and I don't know this in anywhere near the depth you do, but I think I have been aware and had been aware as we came into sort of post Trayvon Martin kind of Black Lives Matter space, which is really 2013, 2014, 2015, and then I think accelerated with the election of Trump in 2016 for all sorts of reasons, is a lot of people locked into that conversation in the last decade and in some sense almost had no idea about what a huge and interesting story it was prior to that. So my narrative, and you can nuance for me, is that we'd actually been making an enormous amount of progress on that front in ways that both would make people on the left side of the spectrum, broadly speaking, happy, but were also really interesting in kind of bipartisan ways. There was all sorts of right on crime stuff, and there was the whole Chuck Colson story, and there were all of these ways in which really people of good faith and good intention and thoughtfulness had collaborated to start to bring down mass incarceration, to start to sort of think constructively about policing in ways that weren't just punitive, to think about things in the court systems, drug courts and other kinds of diversion mechanisms and reforms to bails and all the good and as you've pointed out, incremental, good but incremental ways. And my experience was that the kind of Black Lives Matter, post George Floyd, whatever you want to call it, Great Awakening, seemed profoundly, I don't know if it's ignorant of that story or uninterested in that story, in ways that are just immensely frustrating to me because I felt hey, we're cracking the code on this thing. It still sucks. We still are sort of a society that incarcerates massive numbers of people compared to other industrialized countries, liberal democracies. We still have immense amount of crimes. We still have all sorts of interactions between, the police and, particularly young men of color that create an environment in a lot of neighborhoods that's pretty hostile for people and oppressive. There's all sorts of bad things to deal with, but we were actually dealing with them with a lot of, I think, courage and thoughtfulness and good faith. And it's not that totally went out the window, but it totally got derailed and disrupted. I mean, nuance that for me. That was my perception. That's what I'm imagining from outside this space.
Yeah, I think in broad strokes, I agree with that analysis. I do think that the field of criminal justice reform was for many decades a kind of underneath the radar, technocratic pursuit that I don't want to over egg the batter, right? It's not like everyone was, joining hands and singing Kumbaya and there was, 100% bipartisan support. But there was a significant percentage of right-wing people that kind of bought into this idea that we had gone too far in response to the, massive uptick in crime that we experienced through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and that we needed to right-size the system. There was a broad array, you highlighted some of them, drug court, focused deterrence, problem-oriented policing. There was a variety of reforms that were able to marshal decent evidence that they worked. And there was a whole kind of movement towards being smart on crime was the vocabulary. Evidence-based policymaking was another buzzword. Doing what works, kind of a desire to move the criminal justice conversation off the front pages, in fact, because, the truth of the matter is, for most of my life, I'm 58 years old, up until relatively recently, when criminal justice is a front page story, that's bad for the left, right? That means something bad happened. And, the old truism that if it bleeds, it leads, really, I think, held true for many, many years. And when criminal justice was front and center in the public domain, it generally led to punitive lawmaking. And so all this kind of technocratic incremental progress that you highlighted and that I'm articulating, I think was a response to that. And, starting, 2010, 2011, I think things started to shift. And I guess I would, in addition to Black Lives Matter and these horrible incidents of violence against police brutality against Black Americans, I guess I would really highlight the new Jim Crow book by Michelle Alexander as being a tipping point moment. It increased the salience of criminal justice. It became something that people talked about at cocktail parties in a way that they weren't before, and they were looking at it through a civil rights lens instead of a kind of technocratic law and order lens. And that has some benefits, right? I don't think it's all bad, and I do think that the racial disparities are pretty stark if you spend some time in the criminal justice system, and it's fine to shine a spotlight on that. But I guess I generally share your point of view that it's been bad for the field of criminal justice reform overall, that the more it's on the front page, the more it becomes a hotly polarized, contested issue, the more it becomes culture war churn. It becomes harder to make real progress on the ground.
I'm curious. So when did you and your colleagues found the center?
1996. So it's coming up on its 30th anniversary.
So I'm trying to think of where things were, and this was in New York. Where were things in 1996? When did sort of crime in America, the crack epidemic, mass incarceration, is that pretty close to the peak or just a little bit after the peak?
It's a little bit after the peak. So the murder rate in New York peaks in 1990 with more than 2,200 murders that year. The local incarceration at Rikers Island, which is the jail complex in New York where most people are housed, that peaked, don't quote me on it, but I think 91, 92, where the daily head count was more than 22,000 people on Rikers Island. If you went to Rikers Island, they had these temporary tents that they had installed because they couldn't fit them all in the jails. And it was really a bad moment. And it was a bad moment for New York. I mean, I think things had started to turn in the Dinkins administration and then really accelerated in the Giuliani administration. But, it was a moment where New York was the international symbol of lawlessness and disorder. They were making movies like, I don't know if you're old enough to remember some of these movies, The Warriors and Escape from New York and Fort Apache, The Bronx. I mean, they just don't make movies like that anymore because people don't view New York that way. And just to give a small, little anecdotal indication of how things have changed. So I'm in a book group with 5 other guys, all my age. And I asked them at one of our gatherings how many of them had been the victim of street crime when they were kids. 100%. All of us had been victims of street crime. And then I asked them how many of their kids, each of them have more than one kid, how many of your kids have been victim by street crime, all, living in New York? 0.
Wow.
Again, it's a small sample size. It's just an anecdote, but I do think it's indicative of how things have changed in New York since the early 1990s.
So, I mean, put me in your kind of headspace in 1996. I'm thinking I got to New York. I graduated college in 98. I got to New York fall of 1998. I would say by that point, I did not subjectively experience New York as a particularly, disorderly, lawless place. And I was never the victim of any street crime. So my sort of at least subjective perception of it was that something, I mean, I don't even know if I experienced this way just in light of that history you gave, like something profound had already happened. Does that track with your sense of it? But more importantly, kind of where were you guys? What were the goals of the organization? What did you guys kind of imagine doing? And what was your sort of orientation towards, as I assume kind of a bunch of kind of left liberal types towards the criminal justice system and what needed to happen and the kind of all the things that were happening, particularly in New York, the sort of the various, policing innovations, the broken windows, the CompStat, all that stuff that now is kind of part of that story. Like, where were you guys? What were you facing?
So definitely motivated by a deep and abiding affection for New York and a feeling like New York was in a crisis moment in the early 1990s and things had to change.
You grew up there, by the way? Did you grow up in New York?
No, I grew up in Washington, D.C., which in some respects, so again, I'm 58, so my formative years were the 80s, and that was a deeply dysfunctional. I don't know if you spent time in D.C. in those years, but I was definitely shaped by that experience. And I moved to New York in 1992. So starting really with Giuliani and Bill Bratton, when he was the police commissioner, you saw this focus, as you say, on broken windows, which translated into a very intense orientation towards low-level law enforcement. So you saw, starting in the early 1990s, misdemeanor enforcement go up, basically every year for 20 years. And then at a certain point, when the stop and frisk stuff started to become a really prominent issue under Bloomberg, then you started to see a leveling off of that enforcement. And probably and arguably most people, even the fiercest defenders of broken windows, would claim that at a certain point it went too far and became quota system. But in the early days, as you saw this enforcement ramp up, I think one of the concerns that we had and that motivated the formation of the Center for Court Innovation, as it was called at the time, was we had a flood of new cases coming in, these misdemeanor cases, prostitution, public urination, fare beating, drug possession at the time. And what should the courts do with these cases? And the vision was really trying to create a space in between jail and nothing. And so part of the motivator was, gee, it'd be crazy to send these people to Rikers Island for a week or 2 weeks or a month. Very expensive intervention. There's some indication that if you send people to jail, it's actually, the term of art is criminogenic, that it actually leads to more criminal behavior. And let's try to avoid sending people to Rikers Island, but let's not just do nothing if they've been found guilty for criminal behavior. And so the original kind of project that launched the Center for Court Innovation is called the Midtown Community Justice Center. And it was focused on people that had committed low-level crimes in and around Times Square. And we built just a panoply of what's known in the business as intermediate sanctions for people: community service, drug treatment, job training, links to mental health counseling. And the idea was to give judges more options that they didn't really have in those cases. And that project was successful. Independent evaluators came in and showed that it actually had an impact on people's behavior. It's not a miracle cure, right? The kind of influence even the most successful criminal justice interventions have is, 10% of reduction in recidivism here, 15% there. But it was not nothing, right? And most social interventions fail. So Midtown succeeded in changing the behavior of offending populations at the margins, and then made people feel really good in the neighborhood. They felt like they could see justice in action. And that was really the spark that ignited the Center for Court Innovation. And so from that base, we started doing other projects, most of which were in concert with the New York State court system, and most of which looked like going into the courts, working in a single courtroom, and providing judges with more robust alternatives to incarceration than they previously had. And so the first wave of projects we did were all kind of post-adjudication, after someone has been found guilty of a criminal offense. And then we expanded from that to do not just criminal matters, but family court and housing court and other kinds of cases. And then we tried to move upstream as well to prevent crime. And we launched a bunch of neighborhood-based projects that were more kind of traditional crime prevention projects. And so now, under the woman that's taken my place, her name is Courtney Bryan, who now leads the Center for Justice Innovation. I think it's one of the largest criminal justice organizations in the country at this point.
It's huge, right? I mean, it's hundreds of employees, right?
Yeah. So when I left, there were more than 600 employees. I think it may at one point gone as high as 1,000 employees. Yeah, so it's basically operating at scale. And one of the things that I love about New York, and we can talk about it because, it's controversial too, Center for Justice Innovation isn't the only one. New York has a rich history of nonprofits operating in this space: the Vera Institute of Justice, Center for Employment Opportunities, Osborne Association. There's a lot of great nonprofits that are performing the work that in other places might be performed by government. And people increasingly have a mixed feeling about that.
What was the orientation of the kind of law and order establishment in New York? I mean, so everything from like Giuliani and Bloomberg down to these pretty well-known at this point police chiefs. It was Bratton. Who was the other big one? There was one other
Ray Kelly.
Ray Kelly. Down to the cops and the prosecutors and the judges. What was their orientation towards the kinds of work that you guys were doing? Was it skepticism or cynicism, or just sort of like, if it works, or kind of all of the above?
So, again, the backdrop in New York, while there are kind of law and order types, and there are, of course, prosecutors and there are people right of center. Again, remember, it's New York. So the baseline is way to the left of Texas, Alabama, you name the red state of your choosing. So I can't say on the national front, certainly we got a lot of pushback, the typical soft on crime, hug a thug, as we went out and would speak about this stuff. I can't honestly claim that we were, flying in the face of, the torrent of abuse in New York. Certainly there's skepticism. People that are frontline operators of the system, whether they be prosecutors, judges, even defenders, can be a cynical bunch, right? And there's a status quo bias that exists within the system. And to the extent that we were coming in and asking them to change their behavior or do something different, I think that that's where we got the most resistance.
Just kind of natural bureaucratic inertia, kind of.
Exactly. Rather than really ideological, like, we shouldn't be doing this because we need to incarcerate these people. We got less of that kind of resistance.
I'm curious about the police in New York, because it's funny. Yes, of course, this is still New York, but my experience in Austin, and I don't know if this is the same in New York, is yes, but the culture of the police can be almost totally independent from the culture of the city, right? So my sense of the culture of the police in Austin, for instance, is that it's pretty conservative. It's pretty like, if I had to guess, a lot of them voted for Trump. A lot of them live in the suburbs. Like, it's what you think of when you think of tough guy, macho police culture, which is very distinct from Austin. I don't know the extent to which that's true in New York, although I imagine it's like, oh, well, they all live, out in Staten Island with the firemen or something like that. At the same time, I know just from reading the stats that, on a lot of those metrics in terms of what we would like to think of as like, high performing, well-behaved police, use of force incidents and things like that. And that New York cops come out much better than a lot of other places. What is the culture of the police in New York?
Right. So take this with a super grain of salt, because I am not a police insider, and it's a very insular organization. It's a paramilitary organization. It's an organization that doesn't naturally default to reaching out beyond its walls. So I've been, an informed, half-informed kind of observer of it for decades, and did do projects in partnership with the police. So again, I don't want to overstate my expertise here. I think that your characterization is fair. I think it can be a small C conservative institution. I don't know how people vote in the NYPD these days, but I guess I do think that there was again, I don't want to over-egg the batter, because certainly a lot of people would just roll their eyes at the kinds of projects that we were doing at the Center for Justice Innovation. But I think that there was, at least among a certain non-negligible percentage of the cops that we dealt with, a real interest in the kinds of things that we were doing, because we were very careful in how we talked about our projects. And so the language was always about, well, there should be accountability for crime, right? And we shouldn't just give people a get out of jail free card. And in fact, things like drug treatment are really hard. People find those things really difficult. It's often harder to do drug treatment than it is to do a stint in incarceration, right? Which people, after they've done it once or twice, can do it in their sleep, basically. We also did a lot of community restitution projects, very visible projects, where we put people that had committed low-level offenses to work, repairing the neighborhood, cleaning up graffiti, cleaning up local parks. That kind of stuff, got us a huge amount of support among a certain population within the NYPD, because they were like, oh, one of the complaints you often would hear from the NYPD in those days, I don't know how much it feels live anymore, I think it probably still does, is we make the arrests, we have this complaint from the public, we make the arrest, and then we see the guy out the next day doing the same thing. And why we hand the problem off to the prosecution and to the court system, and nothing is done. And to the extent that we were able in some of our projects to say, hey, here's something is being done here, actually, not nothing, that won us a fair amount of support within the NYPD.
I have very complicated feelings about police, in the sense that, like, and some of this from my childhood. My dad was a lawyer, and sometimes he'd do just some defense work, but he also had various lawsuits for like race and sex discrimination against the police. My dad was not a fan of the police. So I grew up in a household where it was a given. I mean, I can almost literally remember my dad saying, "Yeah, well, I mean, if you put cops on the stand, they'll lie." That was the air I breathed. And also, I just have a kind of visceral aversion to the kind of authority that cops exert, right? They're just sort of coming into a space, physically positioning oneself vis-a-vis, and this is, and I was never arrested, but I mean, whatever. Intimidation is sort of part of a kind of preemptive intimidation is part of just the MO of police officers. And I kind of viscerally dislike that. That said, it's a very difficult job. You're seeing the worst of people on a regular basis. And I also think, and this is sort of like, I'm trying to think of how to put this, and this speaks to what you're saying about how you're very careful about how you talk about it, and also some of my frustration about just kind of the left-wing rhetoric around this stuff is like, they feel like a brute fact that we would be wise to take seriously and cater to or pander to an extent necessary. There's probably nicer language than that. But what cops have is the capacity, and maybe you saw this in the aftermath of the George Floyd stuff, is to essentially draw down, right? Like withdraw from these areas and issues of sort of disorder and chaos in the public realm. And then when that happens, basically disorder grows, right? So they have the power to inflict greater disorder on us by just doing their jobs less well. And we would be wise to be cognizant of that, even if we don't like it. And they're kind of sensitive. It puts those of us who would like to see reform and who have various kinds of issues, visceral, political, racial justice with the police as an institution, in a difficult spot. I'm not sure what the question is in that, but I'm just curious, like, how you saw them in that way, as potential partners, as potential obstacles, all of the above. Does any of that resonate for you?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated topic, and I share some of your complicated feelings about it. I guess just to riff on a couple things in response. So one of the things that we did when I was at the Center for Justice Innovation was that we would try to bring local police at the local level together with teens for kind of conversation, break down the walls between them, break down misconceptions. And one of the insights that I took away from that was that one of the things I sat in on one of these sessions once, and the teens said, "Well, to the cop, why do you always, when we engage with you, you always stand apart from us? You don't come close to us and engage us. Are you scared of us? That sends this kind of chilling message." And the cop was like, "Well, let me tell you why I do that. I do that because I'm wearing a gun. And we're taught to create a space, I can't remember how many feet, a 6 feet distance from you so people won't lunge for the gun." And you could just see that this was like a small example of, the realities of their life, and the training they go through does create barriers for healthy dynamics with the community. And it was a light bulb moment for a lot of the people in that room, like, oh, like, you're not being condescending to me. You're just following the rules, and the rules have some basis in them. So again, I do think police community relationships are really complicated. I do think there's lots of bad cops. I do think they own space and own situations in ways that feel negative sometimes. But just to defend them for a second, there's some good reasons behind some of the things they do. I think that another riff, one of the things that has frustrated me post Floyd was there was this moment post COVID, I guess, as much as post Floyd, where violence really spiked in New York and in other cities. And you saw shootings go up, and you saw murder rate go up, its highest increase, year to year increase ever, basically. And in that moment, I felt like there was just a deafening silence from the left, from my perspective, which was frustrating. And even worse than that, you would see a number of intellectuals, professors, academics, when the topic did come up and the question of like, well, what should we do about this, refuse to acknowledge the very, very solid evidence that policing does actually reduce crime. And whatever negatives, I mean, real harms come along with policing, and you've highlighted some of them. But it is really important to look honestly and squarely at the data And my reading of the data, and I don't think I'm alone in this, I think that the preponderance of credible people that look at this stuff suggests that good policing, hotspot policing, precision policing, really does reduce crime. And I think part of the frustration I've felt with some elements of the progressive left over the past decade is like an utter failure to reckon with that reality. And so to the extent that that's part of, I heard that embedded in part of what you were saying, is the reality is that these people exist. The reality is that they can make a difference. And to ignore those things or to try to wish them away feels like an exercise in magical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, you detected that properly. I mean, I think for me, one place I go to, and I'm not sure who the political theorist would be who articulates this best or earliest, is probably like Hobbes or something like that. One thing that the left has been sort of poor on is like a sense of order for people is such a fundamental desire for a sense of order and safety and stability is such a core, almost pre-political instinct that if you don't address that, everything else goes out the window. If you don't take seriously the fact that most people of every color, of every class, of every ethnicity, if they feel unsafe in their neighborhood, in their building, with their kids walking to school, there is almost nothing they won't accept if you can tell them that you'll make them feel safe. And to ignore that in the interest of anything else, it's almost not an ideological issue. It's just like a brute political fact. Like, you will lose if you don't take seriously people's desire for order and stability and safety from crime. You will lose politically because it's almost like the most visceral thing there is. And the police, and as you said, like the evidence was pretty clear. It is pretty clear that the police in the United States, for a variety of reasons, are just a kind of necessary element in keeping a lid on disorder and crime. And not recognizing that is just like the height of political stupidity.
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, at the risk of revealing my age, I think my sense of politics was profoundly shaped by Bill Clinton's success in '92. And the fact that again, I have a critique of Clinton. I do think he went too far in some respects. But, part of the narrative of that campaign, or at least my understanding of it, was they did not want to be tarred as soft on crime. And, this is coming out of the Dukakis failure, where he really was, part of that loss was being tarred as soft on crime. And I think that, again, I'm not a political strategist. I mean, I do care about this stuff, obviously, just because I'm a citizen and I have thoughts about things. But I do think that my perception of the success of Clinton-era Democrats was saying, yes, that safety, you're not a racist, you're not a reactionary if you want to walk down the street without being hassled, and that the police have a role to play in that. And the key move that they also made was police shouldn't be the end all. And the thing that distinguishes them from the right is that our answer to every public safety problem can't be the police. Police are just one component of a larger array of initiatives that we should be doing. And that looks like crime prevention, that looks like alternatives to incarceration, that looks like a host of more progressive coded interventions, and that we can do both. But I feel like there's an element of the progressive left that has lost that over the last decade or so, and won't even cop to police have a role to play, and there's good evidence to support that they actually do this thing that they're tasked with some degree of effectiveness. And I think that is deeply problematic for democratic politics in general. And I would argue that that's part of why we've seen Trump succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't fancy myself a political strategist either. I think what I fancy myself is a kind of folk political psychologist, in a sense, which is I look at what's in myself and my psyche and my experience, and I take from that and I try to generalize from that, like, what are people's experience in the world, and what are the kind of emotional, psychological, visceral responses sometimes that should tell us something about how politics operate. And I don't mean to rope you into one of my hobby horses, but like, I think two of the kind of fundamental insights, or I think of them as insights that I've had in reaction to progressive politics of the last 10 or 15 years is one that about sort of crime and disorder. The other one, and you do actually write about this a little bit when you get into the nonprofit space, is I was always very attuned to the fact that the form that some of the DEI training, equity rhetoric, asked white people to operate in these sort of discourses, conversations, groups around issues of sort of common concern in a subordinate role to people of, whether it's men to women or white people to black people or straight people to queer people or something like that. There was a kind of implicit and often very explicit assumption that we should work, allies. That was the term, right? That was the kind of catch-all term, which is fundamentally to defer to people's lived experiences of these kind of marginalized identities. And I always believed, and I think I've been vindicated, sadly, that both there's a kind of a lack of dignity in asking people to just not be sort of voices for their own concerns in a democracy, but also at a political level, it's ultimately a loser. There's only so long that you can ask people to sort of operate in the sort of common discourse in a fundamentally subordinate role before they will get angry and have a backlash. It doesn't work in a democracy. Like, I guess it can work in a sort of authoritarian or totalitarian society where the state is coercing people of a particular race or ethnicity or religion into being subordinate. But in a democracy where you need people's vote and their support ultimately, and where white people are sort of majority of the population, of the voting population, like it's just a dead end. Politically, we just have to deal with these things. And maybe that's my rant, which I won't rope you into.
No, I mean, I think that what you create, which I think that we've seen, is you create a lot of, what's known as preference falsification, where you can cow, certainly at the level of an individual organization, or maybe at the level of a city, you can cow people into silence on these issues. It doesn't necessarily change their opinion. And to use psychological language, it's like the return of the repressed, right? Like they'll take it out on you at the ballot box or however they can. And again, I think that motivated a certain percentage of Trump voters. One thing that I just want to push back on slightly is that what people of color think about criminal justice is a complicated question. Right. And I think that one of the frustrations that I've had about, again, progressive left discourse over the past decade or so is that there's been a presumption of what Black people in America think about criminal justice that I think doesn't wholly match up to what the data says.
Yeah.
And so in elite spaces like an elite NGO like the one that I ran or at the New York Times, you get a certain slice of Black American opinion. But if you look at the polling, and this has been pretty consistent, even in the dark days of 2020, most Black people want more cops in their neighborhood. And circling back to the kind of the reality, the grand reality of police that the Dems and the left have to deal with, in point of fact, police are one of the most trusted institutions in the United States when you look at the survey results. And this is even after all of the very justifiable concerns and critiques, many of which I share. And so there's some certain realities that you just have to deal with politically. And I think that there's been magical thinking that you could just wish them away,
Thank you for that kind of nuancing. I agree with you 100%. Like, there has been a sort of shift on that, right? There have been some good books. Isn't there like the James Foreman Jr. book?
That's a great book, Locking Up Our Own.
There was another book kind of about, I think also about how the push for, the Clinton era push for more policing. And even prior to that, some of the like old school law and order stuff was coming from Black communities, right? Black communities that didn't desire punitive measures to the exclusion of all sorts of other measures, but just the people who were on the front lines of like dealing with the high levels of crime in the 80s and 90s and the disorder. And there has been a shift back. I mean, I think it is being assimilated. But you're right. Like, it is always important to remember. And one of the things that's happened in these elite spaces is that the people who are Black elites, queer elites, Hispanic elites, all of these, that is not necessarily a representative. I mean, think about Hispanic elites, right? Like, that is not necessarily, and how many Hispanics voted for Trump, particularly Hispanic men in the last election. Like, that is not necessarily a representative band of opinion for the population as a whole. It's very hard in the context, maybe we can switch a little bit to the nonprofit space and these sort of organizational spaces. It is very hard, verging, I would think, on impossible in some situations to try and explicitly draw that distinction as, say, a white guy, a middle-aged white guy, as we are in one of these spaces where, one of these racially diverse spaces, but maybe not educationally or class diverse spaces, where you're trying to negotiate these issues, right? I just imagine you're one of the co-founders, you're CEO for 18 years. Who could have more authority than you, in theory, But I'm sure there were times when you felt like you had to tread very carefully when you're having these discussions internal to the organization or in other kinds of all sorts of spaces, I'm sure, that you've been in over the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, for sure. I tell this anecdote in my most recent book, but I'll share it here. So when de Blasio comes into power, what is that, 2014, I guess? Part of de Blasio winning, Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York City, he did run on kind of ending stop and frisk. It was a very hot issue at the time. And he hired Bill Bratton to be his police commissioner. And one of the first things that Bratton did was hire someone to be his deputy commissioner, this woman, Susan Herman, who was not a cop. She was a victim advocate. And her goal was to, as she put it at the time, that she wanted to drain the moat around One Police Plaza, that she wanted to really change the dynamic with the community, welcome in community groups, nonprofits, really change the whole culture of the NYPD. And so I knew Susan a little bit just as a fellow traveler in the NGO space. And so when I heard she got appointed, I invited her to come talk to the Center for Justice Innovation at a staff meeting. And I think it was the first public thing she did after getting appointed. So she came to a staff meeting, hundreds of people, and she's great. You know, she's entirely consistent with kind of the worldview of the organization. And she said all the right things about the horrors of racially disparate stop and frisk and wanting to, you know, have a softer, kinder, gentler NYPD. And so at the end of it, I was like, oh man, this is like a great moment for my organization, right? Here's this like super important person in our local firmament saying all the right things, taking the time, honoring our position in the world. You know, she could do a million things, but she chose to come to speak to us. And in the aftermath of that, several staffers came up to me and complained and said, how dare you platform a representative of a racist organization? Doesn't that make us complicit in the racism of the NYPD? And that was one of my first real visceral, I don't want to over exaggerate. It wasn't like, you know, the entire organization came to picket in my office. It was a handful of people. But that was one of my first indications that, oh, like how I'm seeing the world is no longer in sync with a good portion of my organization. And by the time I left the organization 6 years later, I don't think I would, you know, at the risk of revealing what a fraidy cat I am, I don't think I would have invited someone from the NYPD to talk to our staff by 2020 because they would have gotten an explicitly hostile reaction. And so I think that's just a small anecdote, but an indication, as you say, that, again, I had a lot of sweat equity. I was the boss. I had a lot of power within the organization. And at the risk of revealing something unflattering about myself, it became really hard for me to be myself in that situation. These social dynamics have real power. And to defend myself just for a second in my cowardice, you govern with the consent of the governed, right? And, you know, I'm very skeptical of some on the kind of anti-woke left whose advice to organizational leaders is screw these people, you know, just, you know, the truth is you need the good faith, good spirit effort of staff in order to do the work of the organization. So just saying fuck you to them is not, I think, a winning organizational leadership strategy. And so it became very increasingly difficult for people like me to navigate the space as the years went on.
What did you say? Do you remember what you said when they came to you? I mean, I can guess some version of it, but like...
I don't remember specifically what I said, but I remember expressing surprise because, you know, the other thing that was shocking to me is that, you know, we would hire people and what the organization did was not wrapped in mystery, right? Like it's on the website. Like the organization exists to the model of change that we were pursuing was we're going to partner with the criminal justice system to try to change the criminal justice system from within. This is not a legislative advocacy organization. This is not a community mobilization, grassroots advocacy organization. That's what our theory of change is. If you don't like it, don't come work here, right? But we're not disguising who we are. Like we explicitly partner with the police sometimes. But notwithstanding that, I remember expressing shock that, like, what did you expect from this organization? Somehow were we not clear on our communication? So that was the frustration.
No, I mean, I look, I've had similar experiences myself. Like, it's interesting to think about if you could have known what was coming, what would one have done, right? What would one, because I think to your point about sort of how organizations work and how they function, I think a lot of people ended up in just sort of impossible situations, right? Because, and I don't know what the situation was with your board, but like if the board doesn't have your back, right? If it's like a governing board and the board doesn't have your back and the board is is caught up in all of this stuff too, you could take some of those. You could, whether you were super hard line and say, hey, if you don't want to, get in line, you can hear your walking papers or something like that. Or you could try and just do it in a softer way, assert some kind of line. But if your colleagues don't have your back, if the board doesn't have your back, if you're a kind of lone wolf trying to do that, you will lose, right? So it's like the fantasy, organizations are just like, they're not linear functions or something like that. The fantasy that you could just kind of bring down the hammer and prevail, I think is just that. It's a fantasy. Now, if one knew what was coming, and how could one know what was coming, right? What would you do? I mean, you would have to do things like, this is me just totally spitballing. You'd have to kind of do work building support with the board or whatever, or donors or whomever it was who was kind of, even if you're the CEO, you still serve somebody. You probably would have to think about hiring in a very specific way, right? To your point, you can hire people into an organization where it seems like all of these things are explicit, but maybe there's other indicators of like whether they're more or less likely to not kind of fully assimilate that fact or run with the herd when this stuff is happening. I don't know. What do you think? Like if you had to do it all over again and your mission was to try and preserve that sense of the organization whereby the time you stepped down, you could have brought somebody from the NYPD without fear that would be a sort of, rebellion among the staff. Like what could you have done?
A couple of things occur to me. And again, I don't know that there's any magic bullet for this stuff. It's hard to stand athwart history, and yelling
Right.
stop. I do think that being much more intentional in the hiring process and much more explicit and not just expecting that people would look at the organization, ask their friends about it, look at the website, but being very, very clear, like, this is who we are. Are you comfortable operating in this dynamic? So I think that we could have been much better in that respect in the hiring front. I do think that you're right. And just to back up a second, my take on the dynamic that's kind of unfolded at a lot of these kind of left-leaning liberal NGOs like the one that I led was it really was a pincer movement. You had the staff that were younger staff, millennial staff coming up that were kind of to the left politically and had different kinds of expectations of what an organization should look like. But you also had downward pressure coming from donors as well. And you had a lot of the left-leaning foundations moving considerably to the left, putting a lot of pressure on organizations to diversify their leadership, to engage in DEI programming. And so I do think that a fair amount of work would need to be done with external players like your foundation supporters to reckon with this stuff. One of the things that I write about in the book, and the last thing I'll suggest is, I think that, and don't get me wrong, I was never like a command and control kind of leader, but there was a certain kind of expectation that I had. Like I was the boss, I would say something and we would do it. And I think that over time, I've come to believe in a much more that kind of way of being in the world. Like you just can't depend on the fact that you pay people's paycheck for them to execute what you want to do anymore. And I do think that speaks to or argues for a much more kind of democratic form of decision making, which I think is possible in a nonprofit setting in a way that it might not be possible so much within a corporate setting or a government setting. And so I would look for opportunities really to engage staff more than I did at the time in decision making, so that they felt like they had a voice in decision making in a way that I didn't always give them. So I think that would be part of the kind of protective prophylactic measures that I might take if I had to do it all over again.
It's interesting. My instinct is that would end you up in just like that would just accelerate the difficulty. I'm trying to and maybe there's a nuance here that I'm missing. It seems to me that like not that the way to implement this is in a kind of dictatorial sense, but wouldn't sort of, a kind of democratic ethos in that sense give more power to people who don't necessarily have the kind of DNA of the organization in their blood and bones to the extent that kind of a strong leader does. And don't a lot of nonprofit organizations, like any organization, kind of often succeed or fail or kind of tread water, in relationship to the kind of vision and strength of leadership?
Yeah. So maybe I stated it too broadly, because I think that those are fair dangers that you've articulated. And I 100% do not believe that most decisions within an organization should be subject to democratic referendum. I think one of the things in my experience that you have to listen to both the words and the music of staff as they're lodging these complaints. And I do think when push comes to shove, there's a bunch of decisions that a NGO leader has to make that people actually don't want to make those decisions.
Right.
Because they're really hard decisions, right? A dispute between two program leads, who gets fired, who gets hired. These are really hard decisions, and the buck has to stop with someone. So I think you're right in pushing back. I 100% don't believe that leaders should, stick their finger in the wind and try to do a plebiscite to determine these things. But I guess I do feel like there are a range of perhaps less crucial but not insignificant decisions that an organization has to deal with, where it is okay to broaden the tent a little bit. And as long as you're explicit on what the limitations are, like, oh, we're not going to involve you in our disciplinary proceedings when there's a staff complaint, but, oh, we're thinking about budgeting for next year. We have $50,000 that we don't know how to allocate. Help us think about where I think that, I guess I'm going to now sound incredibly cynical and Machiavellian, and I don't mean to be, because I don't mean to suggest that you can engage in window dressing and distract people, but I do believe that you can create a steam valve for certain kinds of staff issues. And if you create, okay, here's the lane for staff involvement, and here's a set of decisions where we're going to aggressively reach out to you and engage you and listen to your feedback, I think that would have bought me space, or can buy a leader space on some other more difficult decisions where they're really just going to have to drive that decision making, because at the end of the day, they are the accountable party.
There is the Machiavellian piece of it, and I'm a veteran of kind of a large organization, large bureaucracy. So I know this. There's the kind of Machiavellian managerial, let's say, put it nicer, where there's the managerial piece of it, which is, as you're saying, like, people need a steam valve, people need to be heard, people need to feel consulted. And then there is also, I mean, I'm sure you would agree with this, there is also a kind of just like an openness to input, right? Like a genuine openness to input, right? This is what I'm thinking on this topic. I'm going to make the decision in the end, but maybe there's some things I haven't thought about, right? Let's have this conversation. Let me hear what you're saying. In the process of listening to you, maybe in a broad sense, I'll end up in the same place on my decision, but maybe there'll be some sort of modifications to it that reflect your input that I value. Maybe I'll change my mind, right? Genuinely, right? Like, this is what I think is the best idea, but let's put it out there. And then, but as long as you recognize that at the end, I'm the one who's going to make the decision. And as you said, most of the time, they actually want you to be the one who makes the decision, right? And people get anxious when they don't feel like there's anybody in charge, which kind of breeds its own degree of kind of chaos and disorder and unhappiness. So yeah, I mean, we're probably on the same page. I just thought it's kind of worth teasing that out.
Yeah, I think that that's 100% correct. And I don't want to, I feel like I'm portraying myself as a horrible leader.
No, you're too moderate seeming in affect for anybody to believe.
So one of the things that I did that I think was successful along the lines that you just articulate when I was running this organization was that every week I had open office hours for 3 hours, 1 day a week, where I wouldn't make any meetings. Anyone could pop in without an appointment and just shoot some people wanted to just shoot the shit. They just wanted to have a relationship with me and talk about sports or hip hop or what,
Yep.
some interest of mine.
British hip hop, I hear.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty niche interest. But some people had complaints and some people wanted to convince me of things. And I found even something as simple and relatively painless as that went a long way towards making people feel like they did have a voice in the organization. And they had again, it was a fairly large organization. It was more than 600 people at this point. that people had a direct connection to me and could voice their concerns, even if ultimately I might make a decision in the other direction.
I think, it's funny. I'm digging into this for two reasons. One is most of my guests are just freaks who have never actually worked a real job in a large bureaucracy in their life. They're just freak intellectuals and writers who just are sort of both mystified but utterly bored by the nuances of life in large organizations. So I'm enjoying just kind of nerding out with you on some of that stuff. The other thing, and this is, I don't know why I've been thinking about this a lot in the last few days, which is the tragedy of Black Lives Matter or the Great Awakening or something like this for me. And I really do think it's a tragedy in that sort of classic sense, is that it feels to me like there was an enormous opportunity that was almost entirely wasted. And, you get these moments in American history and, in open societies where, for whatever constellation of reasons, energy surges on behalf of sort of progressive change, and to move us closer to the society in which we would like to live. And then, that window is open for a while, and then for a variety of reasons, it closes. What form that takes then determines what comes of it, right? And so you look at these things, whether it's like abolitionism or gay rights or the civil rights movement, or, the labor movement, late 19th, early 20th century, mid 20th century, where we've had these kind of enormous advances in sort of equality and justice and whether it's, distribution of wealth and power, or it's just according dignity to people who had not been treated with dignity by virtue of, whatever identity aspect, previously in our society. And it feels like it was one of those moments, and it feels like we blew it. And it feels really important to me to sort of think hard about both why we blew it, but how we won't blow it next time, right? That's the kind of the important part of this. And in the internal workings of advocacy and organizations and nonprofits is actually really important to that endeavor. And, I don't the time will come again, right? And the question is the framework that people have, the new Jim Crow or something like that? Or is the framework something that, in my opinion, is kind of more constructive? There are parts of our society that are just suffering so much, and there's so much injustice happening, and we should really do something about that. But we got to know what we're doing in order to do something about it in the right way.
I second almost all those emotions. I guess the one thing, I have a slightly more optimistic spin. I do think that we're in a bad moment, and I think it's hard to have too rosy a view of the impacts of Black Lives Matter sitting here having this conversation in 2026. But of course, this is just a snapshot moment, right? And who knows? I'm kind of open to the possibility that you and I will have another conversation in 10 years and be able to trace some more positive developments, and that there really was this wonderful moment where so many people across class, across race, across geography were coming together to say that they want to be opposed to racism and that they want better policing. And I do think that, who knows, some of the seeds that were planted then, we don't know how they're going to flower 5-10 years down the road. And so that we could be seeing positive impacts. I mean, I guess I don't know, I've written about this before. I do think within the field of criminal justice, in my lifetime, my perception is that we have swung wildly. There's been these different epochs where we swing between pessimism and optimism and then back again. And I guess, my hope for the near future is that we've just gone through a period that I think was fairly pessimistic, that, the new Jim Crow, right? The new Jim Crow is still Jim Crow. And all this rhetoric on the left that it's 400 years of unmitigated racism, and it's hardwired into the DNA of American society, it goes to the core of who we are as an institution. That's a deeply kind of the Afro-pessimistic strain of thought is I think has been very influential. And I feel like we're at a moment where we could have a turn towards a more optimistic view that in life, modest expectations, this is one of the things I try to teach my kid, modest expectations are in fact the key to having a happy life. And if we just ratchet down our expectations, so we're, we live in the real world. There are bad people. People are still going to commit crime. Police are still going to do bad things, but there's a set of things that we can do. I just reviewed this book by Jennifer Doliak, who's an economist, who wrote a book called The Science of Second Chances, which is just out this week, which I recommend to all your listeners. And she catalogs, I don't know how many programs, 24, 36, and some of them are not, rocket science things. Some of them are very small incremental changes that she can demonstrate have had a positive impact on the world and will actually reduce crime. So I think that there are things that we can do if we can just manage to turn the discourse towards a more positive, optimistic view, that we can change things, but we just are not going to ever be able to create the Shangri-La where there are no prisons, there's no police, there's no need for enforcement. I think that sets us up for an unrealistic expectations.
Talk about wild swings. I mean, you and I would have been having a very different conversation 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, right? When the news looked bad, when crime was going up, murder was going up, disorder was going up. And now here we are in 2026. And my read on the news is it's all good, right? It's all good. Like that was the aberration. And obviously there's places where this isn't true, but at the broad level, crime continues to go down and it kind of continues to go down on every level, right? So it's not just murder, it's also property crime and, and other things like that. And so I don't want to be too pessimistic and I want to be open to your point that like, some of the stuff that happened during Black Lives Matter may bear fruit, and part of the issue we have is that good programs often take time to bear fruit, right? So it's not fair of me either to sort of look at what happened in Black Lives Matter and say it was always just one giant wasted opportunity because there may, as you say, there may have been a lot of seeds planted that bear fruit. But I also just want to get your take on that. Like, I assume there were some moments of despair for you when it looked like a lot of this immense progress we'd made was heading in the wrong direction and might keep heading in the wrong direction or sort of plateau at a worse spot than where we were. And then all of a sudden it didn't. And we're moving in the right direction again.
Yeah, no, very similar to what you just articulated. And there was this moment post-COVID, crime spikes, and you had a huge part of the kind of intellectual community that I'm a part of refusing to acknowledge that there were things like hotspot policing, like focused deterrence, that could actually make a difference. And that was the slough of despond for me, is like, how are we going to get out of this box if we're not even willing to grapple with the things that might meaningfully be a short-term intervention that makes a difference? I mean, I circle back to just listening to you talk. I circle back to where you started, which was that the need for safety, the need for order is somehow hardwired into us as a primal desire that precedes any kind of ideological orientation, in fact. From my perspective, taking care of public safety is the baseline foundation for any other left project that you want to engage in. And I think that you're seeing perhaps signs of that with Zoran Mamdani's success here in New York City, where he has 100% walked back. He was an egregious offender on some of his texts at the time were textbook negative. NYPD is a racist institution with its boot on your throat. We need to get rid of it. Really egregious. And he's done a 180 on that. I wonder whether again, I don't want to over-index on Mamdani because I think New York is kind of so different from even Austin, so different from so many other places that there's only so many lessons you can draw from the Mamdani success so far. But one that I wonder whether it is perhaps transferable to Democrats across the country, take public safety off the table, in fact. Take more police funding, emphasis on good policing, and that will give you the space to do whatever other projects. In Mamdani's case, it's a focus on affordability. In Austin, it'll be something different. I just wonder whether that's the way forward for the Democrats, is to really do whatever it takes to get public safety off the table as a primary political issue.
Well, and I think one of the lovely sort of fortuitous things that we've learned about criminal justice reform, and maybe you knew this going in, but I certainly didn't, is that so many of the interventions and so many of the kind of complex psychological and sociological dynamics are not what we might call conservative ones, right? Like, yes, coercion and punishment are part of and police are part of the equation in ways that are probably always going to make people on the left feel uncomfortable. But there's all sorts of other good news about human psychology and the capacity of state and nonprofits and various other people to sort of create win-win scenarios, right? I mean, one of the things you've hammered about New York City is that part of the transformation was both a reduction in crime and a reduction in incarceration, right? And I read your review of Jennifer Doliak's book. I was listening to her. I think she was on Coleman Hughes's podcast. There's all sorts of things we found out that are actually really nice to find out. Like a lot of people, if they don't have to go to jail on their first offense, that reduces recidivism relative to sending them to jail, right? It actually makes the public more safe to not send, and it's probably certain classes of crimes, but not send first offenders to jail as opposed to sending them to jail. And there's all sorts of findings like that, right? That are really win-wins from a progressive perspective.
Yeah, I think that Doliak's book does a good job of pointing and making the argument that we can have a much more lenient criminal justice system. Let's try to avoid sending people to incarceration if we can. Let's try to avoid people having a criminal record, if we can do that. I think she's pretty persuasive on those points. But the trade-off that she highlights is that we shouldn't accomplish that by turning our back on enforcement. In fact, enforcing the law is incredibly important, and communicating to people that if they break the law, they will get caught is actually an important component. And so doing things, she argues for a number of things that I think will put progressives' hair on fire, like having, expanding DNA databases, expanding electronic monitoring and the like. But I guess, the stuff that makes me most hopeful, I do think, my lived experience, back to one of the things that you said earlier, I lived in New York, and for quarter century, crime went down basically every year, and incarceration went down basically every year. So contra what I think is the right-wing point of view, it is possible to do both. And it is possible to create this virtuous cycle. And I do think that part of that is addressing the context in which criminal behavior happens. And so there's a host of interventions that government can do that have nothing to do with the police, that are just kind of win-win-win from my perspective. If you improve street lighting, if you just make it a little brighter, that will reduce crime. If you take care of vacant lots, and so that they're not trash strewn, but you green them, and so you have a nice garden in them, there's evidence to suggest that will improve public safety. So there's a host of things that we can do like that will just make life better. And one of the lines of criminal justice thinking and research that's, most powerful to me is that, we all know intuitively what safe neighborhoods and good neighborhoods feel like. And they don't feel like police states. In fact, they don't have a cop on every corner, but those are neighborhoods, and they're not all of them. It would be a lie to suggest that all of them are affluent neighborhoods. Sure, there's some relationship between safety and affluence. I don't want to deny that there's some connection. But there are plenty of working class neighborhoods that are perfectly safe. And those are neighborhoods where there's a strong sense of community, where neighbors look after each other. There's, the Jane Jacobs eyes on the street, whether it be the neighbor or the shop owner. Those are the kinds of things that we should be kind of orienting towards. In addition, we should definitely have a criminal justice system. We should definitely have police should do their job. But there's a host of other things that government and NGOs should be investing in that can make us safe, that are just kind of creating stronger, safer, more vibrant, vital communities.
It's funny. It's like, it's easy enough to say, I have this fantasy, right? It's like, instead of what happened with criminal justice over the last decade, the cry was for more and better training for police, but also more funding for all these kind of diversion courts and more funding for community. So rather than setting those things in opposition, rather than like abolish the police or defund the police so we can fund all these other things, which there's more or less evidence for that they contribute to these things, like all of the above, right? Like this fantasy that this great kind of moral crusade of our time was kind of all of the above. And there's part of me that's like, but that's a fucking fantasy too, Dan, right? Because the things that mobilize great passions are not Greg Behrman, Dan Oppenheimer, incrementalist agendas, right? They're not that those don't have power. They do have power in sort of modern technocratic, bureaucratic regimes. They have immense power. But the things that mobilize that kind of moral fervor Well, are kind of more Manichean, right? They are more good versus evil. Like it's unrealistic. It's utopian to imagine that the death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer would lead to a campaign that included, more and better funding for the police. Let's make sure that the police in Albuquerque are doing as good a job as the police in New York or something like that, right? And so I don't think there's a solution for that, because on some level, I don't know that the left, for good and ill, can accept the fact that nobody wants a police officer in every corner of their neighborhood, but most people would rather have a police officer than a drug dealer.
Yeah, that's well.
And that's
well
a
put.
hard fact.
Just to riff on that for a second, 100%. Unfortunately, kind of my moderate nuance and perhaps your way of viewing the world is never going to get more than 5 people, and maybe not even my immediate family, can I convince to come out into the streets in favor of my view of the world. So let
more nuance. Yeah,
exactly. So let's be honest about that. And I do think, again, back to, my hope for the future, I do think that Black Lives Matter viewed through the, most rose-colored lens can create a kind of cultural change of consciousness in people and how they view the world that I think could potentially reap dividends down the road. I guess my beef is that, or, one of the things that has frustrated me over the past decade or so, and this gets to a critique of our kind of educational institutions, that we've kind of valorized activism.
Right.
We've valorized and suggested to our young people that the only way to create change is through kind of Black Lives Matter, pumping your fist in the air in the streets. That is a path to change, but it is just one path. And I think that, as your critique highlights, there are other paths to change that may, in fact, in certain situations, be more impactful. And so I guess, I'm trying to make a virtue out of just my own personality or orientation to the world. But I do think that a kind of more behind the scenes, low key, technocratic approach to criminal justice, my working theory is that that's more successful in the American context than a more oppositional Manichean black and white, good guys versus bad guys, even though it will never get people out in the streets or motivate 1 million people to like your TikTok.
I mean, one way I think of your endeavor, or at least part of your endeavor, is, it's not going to get the people out into the streets, right? That's not your role in the ecosystem. But we've gone through this period of kind of upheaval and change, some of it good, some of it bad. And there's a lot of lessons learned, and there's a lot of institutional memory and wisdom acquired, which I think we just did. Part of what happened in 2014 to 2024 or something like that, however you want to date it, in these kind of left liberal organizations, whether it was like actual political organizations or nonprofits or advocacy groups or universities or whatever, a lot of what was the case was that there was no institutional memory of dealing with these conflicts, right? And so people like you in your position, and you may have been more savvy than many, just had no sense of how do you deal with this, right? First of all, it took a while to recognize it. And then once you recognize it, what do? You don't have the memory of having fought this kind of battle before. But now we have the memory, right? And I think part of, when you're looking at a book like, what is it called? Nonprofits in Crisis? Is that your new book?
The Nonprofit Crisis.
The Nonprofit Crisis. Like, a lot of what you're doing, as I see it, is, hey, let's try and kind of instantiate these lessons we've learned, right? I mean, not just to this end, but like a lot of what's happening, a lot of the work that some people like annoying anti-woke left liberals like me are doing, if you give us the benefit of the doubt, is like, let's remember what's happened, let's take it apart, let's internalize it, so that going forward we don't make the same dumb mistakes we made, so that we can, in some cases, just continue to do the good work we were doing, right? Because there's organizations, and I think you've written about this, that have totally lost the way, right? Have kind of lost their capacity to just do the good work they do because they had so much mission creep, right? All of a sudden is like, the Sierra Club's doing racial justice or something like that. Or, and this is the optimistic version, they're just there and sort of staffed up and an organizational infrastructure when all of a sudden tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of people who don't have political experience are flooding into this zone and looking for vehicles through which to make a difference. And where do they go, right? If they can go into organizations that have some wisdom, that will do a lot more good than going into organizations that don't have that wisdom, or just creating new organizations in a lot of cases that just don't know what the fuck they're doing, right? And maybe if they're lucky, they'll get there. But like, I think a lot of the successes, this is just my sort of back of the envelope kind of analysis or calculation. I think a lot of the successes of various, what we would now call progressive movements in the early and middle parts of the 20th century there were a lot of organizations that had been through a lot of battles, right? Labor unions, fights against communists in the 20s and 30s. They knew what they were dealing with and were able to kind of mobilize, let's say, the left-wing energy of the 1930s into the New Deal because they had a lot of wisdom about where the pitfalls were. And we just kind of, the left has been in a bad way for a long time. We don't have those memories. The left liberal world doesn't have those memories of how to negotiate the left.
Well, two thoughts in response to that. So one, I think one of the lessons of the past decade for me, I had kind of thought for many years, like, oh, there's just this kind of left project, and I might be slightly to the center within that left project, but we all want the same things and maybe just through different modalities or trying to achieve it. And I guess, you and I have used the expression left liberal a couple times during this conversation. And I guess one of the things that the past several years have highlighted for me is that there's a left project that I'm actually not a part of, that I don't feel like I have a voice in, doesn't represent my values. And that's been clarifying for me. And as you said, it does take you a while to process this stuff. And so one of the things that it's been painful and hard, and it's taken a while and it's imperfect. But one of the things that I feel good about over the past decade is you start to see this kind of more full-throated defense of liberalism with a small L, and liberal values like the rule of law and empiricism, pluralism. I think that's against attacks both from the right and the left. And, Yascha Mounk's work and Frank Fukuyama's work, and go down the list. And I think that that's super important. And I think that for basically my whole life, there was just an assumption that the liberal democratic order was the way of the world. And that's the arc of history is bending towards it. And you don't even have to defend that kind of worldview. And so I do think that you're seeing more full-throated defenses of that. And I kind of, at the risk of being highfalutin, I would situate my work within that. And I guess, the other thing, just to riff on your point, I don't know how it's going to cut. Part of me worries. I think that this is a chastising moment for lots of NGOs. Things like the New York Times piece on the Sierra Club, like that gets shared around and people, cluck at it and nod their heads that this is horrible. And so I do think that there's some part of the sector is kind of grappling with this reality and realizes that some changes are required. And then I think there's another huge part of the sector that's just keeping their heads down and hoping that Democrats win in a couple of years and we're going to be right back into DEI world and nothing's changed. And I don't know which way it's going to cut, or it's going to be a third path. So I don't know whether to be optimistic or pessimistic that we have the muscle memory and that these NGOs, places like Sierra Club, 3 years from now are going to emerge stronger than ever and ready to do the work. I do think, the sadness I have about our current moment is that my perception is at a moment when this country needed NGOs more than ever to be this kind of connective tissue and this force for depolarization, that this is painting with a broad brush. I'm sure there's some NGOs that are stronger today than they were 5 or 7 years ago, but many of them have been dramatically weakened and find themselves not able to perform this function to the extent that I think we need.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. Maybe kind of place to end, just think about it. I mean, I want to make one point that I've said a million times, but kind of want to reiterate, which is I've just been breathing a giant sigh of relief in the criminal justice space in the last year or something because the numbers have been looking so good. And I'm so glad, as you point out, it just creates space for so much. Like it puts the lie to the right-wing narrative. It puts the lie to the left-wing narrative. It shows us that we can actually make a difference in this space. And it's also so profoundly important to so many people. So I'm so happy about that. But I guess the question I would ask you is, to that point you just made, where is the criminal justice reform establishment right now on that kind of spectrum of like having learned some hard lessons, having acquired some wisdom versus head in the sand and like Trump seems to be, underwater, a Democrat will win in a few years and we can go back to defund the police or something like that?
Again, hard to speak on behalf of a, diverse constituency that doesn't ever meet as a group. I guess I would say that I think the current scenario is perhaps even rosier than you depict, because not only do we have crime going down in almost all of our major cities, but we're coming off of a decade when incarceration went down every single year. It was a minor spike up over the last year or two, but there's some indications, because prison enrollment is kind of a lagging indicator of what crime looked like 8 to 10 years ago. Keith Humphreys wrote a piece, which I recommend, in The Atlantic a little while ago, saying that we're going to see incarceration go down dramatically over the next decade. We're going to reap the benefit of the crime reductions that we saw decades ago. So there's the potential that things could get even better over the next decade, and that the trend line will really be positive. I don't know. I think defund is dead.
Yeah.
I think that lesson has been well and truly absorbed, and I'm sure there's some no hopers out there that still in their heart of hearts think that we don't need a police or that don't need prison system. But I really think that those voices have returned to the margins. So I guess I'm feeling mostly optimistic in the criminal justice reform space that we're heading towards a healthier conversation, and that part of that conversation is when crime goes down, you can just have a more rational conversation about these things. But all that is dependent. Unfortunately, we live in a world where we are so susceptible to viral videos, right? And so we had a stream of viral videos of Black people getting killed or hurt at the hands of police. And then we had a stream of videos of really horrible crimes being committed against random people on the subway or in public transit that cut the other way. And, my fervent hope is that somehow we can get out of that dynamic where we're just being pulled between overreaction to some horrible thing that people are seeing on their phones over and over again.
I shouldn't even allow myself to entertain this hope, but I was listening to some podcast at some point or reading something where somebody said that Japan and the United States actually had roughly comparable crime rates in like the mid-century or something, like mid-20th century, and now they essentially have no crime, right? And like maybe we could, I'm looking at these numbers, I'm like, is that possible? Could we like, in 40 years or something like that? I mean, there are these weird tipping point, virtuous cycle and also vicious cycle dynamics in these kinds of things. I shouldn't even entertain it, but it's kind of delicious to kind of entertain that idea.
I mean, one thing that I'm hoping for, there was a moment when, again, I don't think I'm over exaggerating, but you couldn't get architects, you couldn't get social service providers to have a conversation about how to build more humane jails and prisons, because they didn't want to participate in anything that suggested that there were going to continue to be jails and prisons. And so query whether one thing I would love to see, I haven't toured jails and prisons all over the country, but I've been to ones in New York City and New York State. They're really bad. We need to treat people more decently, more humanely. Lots of jails don't have air conditioning. So there's a host of work that I wonder whether we can do that has really not happened or been on pause, is my impression, over the past decade, of improving prison conditions. Let's accept that we're going to have prisons. Let's make them much better. Let's change the orientation. Let's make them truly rehabilitative. Let's not add on to the kind of misery of them by having them be these horrible places where people feel and are completely unsafe as inmates.
I was thinking there was a movie, I think it's Norway or something, called The Artist and the Thief about this. Is a great documentary. He's on Netflix or Hulu, but it's about a relationship between an artist and this thief who stole some of her paintings from her gallery. He was caught like a day later, and they became genuine friends. And you saw these footage of these Norwegian jails, and it's like, it blows your mind. It's like a Days In or something like that. I mean, you're like, oh my God, like it could be like that.
Yeah, exactly. And the deprivation of liberty is no joke. That is a very serious penalty. We don't have to lard onto it like these additional horrible conditions.
All right, some final questions. What are you working on now? What's your next book or article? Or
you're catching me at a bad moment. I'm between big projects. I just finished a book, so please, the pressure to produce another one. I don't know.
All right, The Nonprofit Crisis. Yep.
So the Nonprofit Crisis is just out. I'm thinking about perhaps turning my attention back actually to this idea of what I would call community justice. That there is a world of projects that is not turning your back on engagement with police, prosecutors, judges, etc., but working in concert with them to change their mindset, and that can really be a force for good, not only in kind of creating a stronger criminal justice system. I think the through line through my career really is a desire to improve public trust in institutions. And it's weird because I don't know how you are, but I've kind of hated every institution I've been a part of. But I recognize the importance of institutions and that we can't really function without them. And so at the end of the day, I want to reform institutions so that they function the best that they can. And so I guess I'm thinking of turning my lens next, which is in a way returning to some of the work I did at the Center for Justice Innovation, because I think it's so important. There's so many positive residual resonating effects from having people feel better about the cops, better about police, better about courts. It's not just good for the criminal justice system, but I think it's healthy for our democracy. And so that's vague, inchoate thoughts, but that's kind of where I'm thinking I'm going next.
This question, when I remember to ask it, I ask all my guests, which is, if you had a podcast, what would it be about?
I kind of like the way you do your podcast. I don't share all of your obsessions, like I Terry Gross means nothing to me. But I share a healthy amount of them. And I do the fantasy, I do have a Substack, and the fantasy is that I'm just so interesting as a person that people will come along for my obsessions. So I would love a podcast that would enable me to talk about nonprofits, talk about criminal justice, but also talk about my love of Arsenal football team, also talk about my interest in old school hip hop. But no one's paying for that, unfortunately.
Well, I think, the way to that is, if any of you are listening out here and you feel like Greg would be the right person for this, is one scenario is it's like a kind of institutionally sponsored podcast, at least in a loose way, that's about the thing, whether it's like nonprofits or criminal justice. Like it's about your like official expertise, right? And then that's the kind of anchor, but then you can kind of weave into that in various ways. Maybe there's a segment at the beginning or maybe whatever, you can weave into that. The other, random from our perspective, not from yours, they're unified by your psyche or something like that. The other obsessions or something like that. Maybe it's like you establish your credibility in this kind of more expertise space for a year, and then you start bringing in, Arsenal football and British hip hop and things like that. I think there's I could see that.
You're my role model for that, because I feel like that's essentially what you've done.
Do you know Ben Soskis? Is that a name that rings a bell to you?
I do.
You and Ben should have a podcast or something like that. That'd be good, like nonprofit philanthropy or something like that. I don't know who would sponsor it, but you guys would know. That'd be a good podcast.
That's a good idea. I'll take it up.
Final question, which is, who else should I have on the show?
Who else should you have on the show? Oh, man, that's a good question. I'm trying to look at my bookcase. Who you haven't had on your show already? On some of the questions that we've been talking about today, do you know Roy Teixeira, who's the Liberal Patriot?
I know of him.
I think that his voice has been very powerful. I think do you know the Welcome Party?
No.
It's a moderate factional group trying to move the Democrats to the center and acknowledge some of the realities that we've talked about today. I don't know who the principals are. I don't know the names off the top of my head, but I think those might be interesting voices. But I love, the deep dives, the stuff that I can just give you one consumer's reaction to the stuff that you put out. I mean, definitely keep doing the men's fashion stuff. I love that. But the kind of deep dives that you've done on influential thinkers, like the piece that you did on Wesley Yang was just, I loved, it was so great. The stuff you've done of Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think helping to break down, doing this kind of potted intellectual history of influential figures, I just feel like that's a lane that you do better than anybody else, basically.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I haven't done as much of that as I should. I think I should do more of that. I also want to do, I would do more fashion. It's hard to find the voices. It's not a space in which there's a deep bench of like really thoughtful people. I also want to do more sports. You mentioned like Arsenal football. There are some really smart people in sports. I'm kind of clueless, so it's a little bit hard for me to know like who I should do, but yeah.
I mean, Ethan Strauss, do you listen to Ethan Strauss's podcast?
House of Strauss. Yeah, I should have him. Yeah.
I think he would be really good. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm free associating. I'm spacing on her name. We've talked a lot about wokeness. The woman that wrote the book recently about the MAGA intellectuals.
Laura Fields, The Furious Mind.
Yes, exactly. That's an interesting book to grapple with.
My hesitance is she's like been on every podcast I listen to. It's like I'll probably like wait a year or two and then I'll talk to her or something like that, just so I can be sure I'm not on the news cycle. Greg, thank you so much for doing this and keep up the good work. I genuinely, as I said, I think there's little in our society in the kind of policy space that's more impactful than the kind of work that you do. And I think, you and your colleagues have made a profound difference. I mean, in the lives of probably millions of people, including millions of people who just like didn't, as you were saying about the kind of street crime, like who just simply weren't mugged, right? Or like weren't knifed, and we'll never know. But yeah, thanks for the hard work and keep it up.
That's nice of you to say. And thanks for your engagement with my stuff. I really appreciate it.
This has been another episode of Eminent Americans. Big thanks to my editor, producer extraordinaire, Robert Scaramuccia. Big thanks as well to Alec Owensworth of Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah for letting us use his music for our intro and outro. If you liked what you heard, and I imagine you did if you've made it this deep into the episode, then please rate us on whatever the relevant podcasting platform is. And if you have any questions or comments, email me at djops@gmail.com. That's djopps@gmail.com. I promise to respond at least until the faraway and probably mythical day when I have such a vast audience that I can't in good conscience respond to all the emails while still upholding my responsibility to my loved ones. Have a great day.